The scale stopped me for a quick inspection near the Texas border, but the number on the panel was higher than the weight listed on the manifest, which I had checked myself before leaving. This didn't make sense because the cargo had been properly sealed, with no patches, no swapped papers, and nothing out of place in the signature. While I waited for the inspector to repeat the reading, I heard a low series of knocks coming from the cargo compartment, too dry a rhythm to be loose cargo. And the worst part was that it stopped the instant I got out of the cab, as if someone inside knew exactly when I was close enough to hear it. I went to the back trying to find any mark on the seal, any looseness in the door, or anything that would give me a simple answer. But everything was too clean, too firm, and that's exactly where it hit again, 3 times, from the inside, harder than before. The inspector asked me to realign the truck on the scale again, saying it could be an uneven weight distribution, but the number went up almost the same, and that didn't match the type of cargo I was carrying, because it wasn't anything that could move on its own like that without leaving a mark on the doors or the trailer floor. The wind blew dry from the open side of the highway, kicking up fine dust that clung to the white side of the truck bed, and yet there were no recent marks near the hinges or the seal. Nothing scratched, nothing tampered with, as if no one had touched it since the last dock, which only made that sound harder to reconcile. I looked at the manifest again inside the cabin, going through it line by line as if I had missed something simple, but everything was correctly filled out. Weight, volume, origin, destination, and yet that excess weight remained there, stuck on the display, with no explanation that could be quickly resolved and allow the journey to continue. When I went back behind the trailer, I waited a few seconds in silence, trying to elicit the same pattern I had heard before. But this time it took longer to happen, and when it did, it wasn't the same. There was a longer interval between the beats, as if someone was testing timing, not strength. It was at that point that I thought about opening and closing it right there, but something didn't add up. The seal was too tight, too clean, and opening it without fully understanding could worsen a problem that hadn't yet fully revealed itself. I signed the provisional release with the inspector, saying I would redistribute the load further ahead, something common enough not to raise suspicion at the weigh station, and returned to the cabin trying to keep everything looking normal, even knowing that the weight wasn't simply going to adjust itself after a few minutes on the road. I chose a stretch a few miles ahead where the lighting faded quickly, and the shoulder was wide enough to stop without drawing attention, because opening that trailer in front of too many people could complicate things more than help, especially without knowing exactly what I was going to find inside. While I was driving to that point, the noise didn't return, which was worse than if it had continued, because it gave the feeling that it was waiting for something, and not just happening by chance as poorly secured cargo often does. When I stopped, I left the engine running for a few seconds before getting out, looking in the rearview mirror as if that would show me something new, but the trunk was still, with no visible movement, no unusual vibration, just that silence that didn't match what I had heard before. I picked up the manifest from the bank, not to double-check it, but as a reference for any detail that might match what I saw when I opened it, because if something wasn't listed there, I needed to be sure before making any decision that would put me in the middle of the problem. I started by running my hand along the side of the trailer, as if to find some hidden vibration there, but everything was too rigid, even firmer than normal, as if the extra weight was pressing from the inside out in places that weren't designed to support it. When I got close to the axles, I lowered myself a little to look underneath, and that's when something didn't add up, because the suspension seemed more compressed on one specific side, not uniformly as happens with poorly distributed load, but concentrated as if there was an isolated block pushing only that section. I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out if it was just my imagination because of the dim light from the shoulder of the road, but the more I looked, the more evident it became that something was altering the behavior of the whole system, without any external sign of recent intervention. I went back to the back and put my hand on the door, hoping to feel any knocking from inside, but the silence continued, and that didn't help, because the pattern I had heard before didn't seem random. It seemed deliberately interrupted, as if whoever was inside had stopped to listen to what I was doing. That's when I noticed a small detail on the metal floor near the base of the door, a slight difference in alignment. almost imperceptible if I wasn't looking for it, but outside the factory standard, and that couldn't have appeared on its own without some alteration made by someone who knew exactly where to look. I pressed the flashlight against the base of the door and followed that difference in the floor with the tip of my boot, pressing slowly until I felt that it wasn't just an imperfection, but a piece with minimal play, well fitted, hidden in the metal pattern. And this wasn't a factory thing. It was an adaptation done with too much precision to go unnoticed in a common inspection. I used the lug wrench to create a point of leverage, and when it yielded a few inches, the sound came from inside again, closer, heavier, not like before, and this time it didn't stop when I pulled back. On the contrary, it responded with 2 sharp hits, as if it had understood exactly where I was messing. When I managed to open it enough to create a crack, I felt the air escaping, too hot for that time of night, and with a musty smell, without recent ventilation, and that already ruled out any simple explanation of a forgotten or poorly positioned load inside. Light streamed in through the opening, revealing an internal partition that wasn't visible anywhere else in the trailer, a built-in compartment right behind the doors, isolating the main space. Before I could even grasp its size, something pushed forcefully from the inside, causing the entire structure to vibrate, not just the makeshift cover. It was at that moment that a hand appeared through the crack, quick, trying to reach any external support, and there was no longer any way to pretend that it was a loading error or a documentation failure, because someone was trapped inside, forcing their way out through a space that should never exist in that type of trailer. I instinctively took a step back, releasing the lever and letting the lid give a few more inches because holding it wasn't going to solve anything at that moment, and when the opening widened, the person stepped out too quickly, disoriented, but with enough force to push me aside before I could even try to react. He fell onto the asphalt and got up almost in the same movement, without looking directly at me, breathing heavily like someone who had been in a state of disarray for too long, and what was most striking was not the haste, but the way he already knew where to run, as if that stopping point had been chosen beforehand. Before I could say anything, he crossed the shoulder and disappeared into the darkness on the other side of the highway, without hesitation, without looking for direction, leaving behind only the sound of short, quick footsteps that faded too quickly for someone who had just emerged from a closed compartment. I stood there for a few seconds with the door still half open, trying to figure out if I had just avoided a bigger problem or if I had walked straight into it, because it didn't look like an accident or a loading error at all. It was a structure built to hide people without leaving an external trace. I went back to the cabin and picked up the phone, reporting everything I had seen, giving the location, trailer number, and compartment details. But as I spoke, the only thing that was clear was that I had transported something that wasn't on the manifest, and not through simple carelessness. I stood beside the truck with the engine running, glancing alternately at the empty road and the open back because turning it off there seemed like the wrong decision. But continuing with everything running didn't give a sense of control either. It just kept the scene too active for a place that had already gone beyond the point of normalcy. The minutes began to stretch out without a clear reference point, and each passing car seemed closer than it actually was, while the compartment remained exposed, motionless now, but still with that strange presence of something that wasn't part of the cargo or the route. When the lights appeared in the distance, they took longer than I expected to arrive, and in that time I had already mentally reviewed every step from the dock to that point, trying to find where it had entered without leaving a mark, without registering the weight, without anything that would attract attention before the scale. The agents cordoned off the area, inspected the compartment, photographed everything, and one of the first things they said was that it wasn't a recent makeshift repair. It was a structure designed to pass basic inspections, the kind of modification that only works when no one has strong reason to be suspicious. After that, I no longer accepted sealed shipments without a clear origin, and even when everything is correct on paper, I still stop for a few seconds before leaving, just to listen, because since that day, silence inside the trailer has never again seemed like a sign that everything is normal. If you're enjoying the story so far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these stories to more people. I was already slowing down when I saw the blue light in the rearview mirror, but there was something wrong with the way it was flashing. Too weak, kind of muffled, as if it wasn't designed to attract attention from a distance, only for those who were already close enough. I looked at the radio expecting some kind of patrol warning for that area, but what came through was a short message that didn't match the road I was on, and the voice came out distorted, too fast, as if someone was repeating a code without actually being there. The vehicle pulled up closer, still without any visible markings, and stayed behind me for too long without giving a clear command, just keeping that low blue light on. And that's when I realized that if I stopped there, I wouldn't be able to tell who I was dealing with. I pulled over to the side of the road more out of habit than confidence, leaving the engine running and holding the steering wheel for a few seconds before making any move, because the way that police car had appeared didn't quite fit the pattern I'd seen in other encounters, especially on a nearly empty rural road at that hour. Looking in the rearview mirror, I watched the car door open slowly without any hurry, and the man get out with his headlights dimmed, illuminating the ground more than the road itself, as if he had no interest in showing his face right away. That wasn't exactly wrong, but it wasn't what I expected to see either, and that kind of detail starts small, but quickly becomes a burden when you're alone on a dark highway. The road was too quiet for that kind of stop. No cars passing, no distant headlights appearing on the horizon, just the continuous sound of the idling engine and the light wind blowing against the side of the trailer, which made any movement there much more obvious than it should be. I glanced quickly at the radio, hoping for some follow-up to the alert I'd heard earlier, but nothing came. No update, no confirmation, just that strange silence that didn't help me understand if it was part of some real operation. Time began to seem slower than normal, as if every second was being observed by someone other than me. As he got closer to the door, I could get a better look at his uniform, and that's when something really didn't click, because it wasn't completely out of the ordinary, but it also wasn't exactly the same as what I'd seen before on patrols in that area. Something was missing in the details, maybe identification, maybe a fit, but it was the kind of difference you can't explain in the moment. You just feel it's out of place. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood there outside for a moment longer than usual, as if he were waiting for some reaction from me before taking any initiative. I kept my hand near the window without lowering it yet, trying to buy myself a few more seconds to better understand what was happening, because lowering it at that point didn't seem like a safe decision, and opening it directly didn't seem right either. The blue light was still reflecting in the mirror, but without the intensity I expected from an official vehicle, and that continued to bother me more than anything else. It was at that moment that it became clear to me that I wasn't dealing with a completely normal situation, even though everything there still seemed close enough to the norm to be confusing. I lowered the window just enough to hear and speak, without exposing the interior of the cabin more than necessary, because even trying to act like it was a normal stop, there were still things that didn't quite fit, especially the time he took to say anything. When he did speak, he was too direct, asking for documents en route without identifying himself first, and that was already out of the ordinary for what I was used to seeing in real stops on that type of road. I handed him the papers through the opening, keeping my hand steady, watching how he took them without immediately checking them as they usually do, just holding them for a second longer than necessary before looking. The flashlight remained low, not illuminating my face directly, which was strange because generally they want to see clearly who is inside the booth, and here it seemed the opposite, as if avoiding eye contact was part of the procedure. He asked where I was going, but the way he asked didn't sound like someone checking information. It seemed more like someone who already knew the answer and just wanted to confirm if I was going to say exactly that, and that started to weigh more heavily than the flashing lights themselves. I answered briefly without giving more detail than necessary, trying not to show that I had already realized that something wasn't normal. When he returned the documents, he did so far too quickly, without comment, without guidance, without anything to justify stopping up to that point. And that's what bothered me the most, because a real traffic stop rarely ends without some kind of clear instruction. It was at that moment that I saw, in the reflection of the side mirror, another headlight approaching from behind the patrol car, without flashing lights, without any identification, but slowly aligning itself in the same lane. That changed the situation instantly, because it stopped seeming like a strange approach and started seeming coordinated, and standing there ceased to be a neutral option. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, still still with the window half open, trying to decide whether to follow what was happening or get out before it completely closed in around me. I pulled the truck back onto the road without waiting for a response, accelerating more than usual for that stretch of road. Because staying there stopped made no sense after the second vehicle appeared without identification, and in the mirror I saw the reaction happen too quickly to be a coincidence. The car pulled in right behind me, now with a brighter blue light unlike before, and the other car caught up a few seconds later, maintaining a constant distance without trying to overtake, just keeping pace as if synchronized with my movement. I looked at the radio expecting any official sign of that pursuit, but nothing came. No alert. No confirmation, just silence. And that made everything clearer than any communication could, because if it were legitimate, someone would have already appeared on the frequency. The road remained empty, with no nearby exit, no gas station, no illuminated area where I could stop with any margin of safety. And the more I accelerated, the more the two vehicles adjusted their speed to exactly the same level, without error, without delay, as if they already knew how far I was going to try to go. That's when I realized the car behind had slightly shifted its position in the lane, not to overtake, but to align with the trailer, as if it were preparing something lateral, and at that point, it was no longer an attempt to stop. It was a circle beginning to close in while in motion. I started using the width of the lane in a controlled way, opening slightly to the left and then correcting to the center, not to lose control, but to eliminate any clean line that the car behind could use to align with the trailer, because at that point it was already clear that the intention was not just to follow. The dark vehicle responded too quickly, adjusting its position almost at the same time as me, as if it were anticipating the movement, and that's when I realized that this wasn't an improvised attempt. It was coordination, and the more I moved the truck, the clearer it became that they were waiting for a specific opportunity. The patrol car maintained pressure from behind, now closer, while the other car moved forward a few feet to the side. Not enough to overtake, but enough to get into the blind spot. And it was at that moment that I saw something come out of its window, too low to be a conventional weapon, but aimed precisely at the trailer's tires. The impact was sharp and short, followed by an immediate vibration in the rear, and the truck responded heavily, pulling slightly to one side. Not enough to lose control immediately, but enough to eliminate any clear maneuvering space if it had continued for a few more seconds. There was no longer any way to maintain strategy or buy time, because the siege turned into direct action, and I had to choose between holding the truck in unstable conditions or risking everything trying to get out of that range before they repeated the move. I kept my foot on the accelerator even as the vibration increased, gripping the steering wheel tightly to compensate for the uneven pull coming from the rear, because downshifting at that point would only make it easier for them to finish what they had started, and the truck was still responding enough to try and get out of that range. The speed increased more than I would normally maintain on that type of road, and the control became heavier with each passing second, as if the entire system was working outside its ideal limits, while the two vehicles behind adjusted their distance, without backing up, without pushing too hard, just maintaining constant pressure. That's when the first brighter lights appeared ahead. Not a gas station, but a larger intersection with more open lighting. And that changed their behavior instantly, because the sidecar backed up a few feet, and the patrol car reduced the intensity of its approach as if that point was no longer favorable for continuing. I drove straight past without slowing down, still holding the truck at the limit of my control. And when I looked again in the mirror, the two had already moved far enough away to disappear into the darkness, without any attempt to retake the road, without any insistence as if the operation had a clear limit to where it could go. Only after a few miles was I able to safely slow down and stop in a properly lit area, getting out to see the damage to the trailer, and it became clear that this wasn't an attempted robbery, but an attempt to forcibly stop me without leaving any identification. I stopped under the bright light of the intersection and turned off the truck only when I was sure there were no more headlights approaching from behind, because until that moment, any light in the mirror seemed to carry the same doubt that had started back there on the dark road. When I got out, the smell of hot rubber was still in the air, and the tire showed damage that was too clean to be wear and tear or a common failure. It was a targeted impact, designed to compromise without exploding immediately. I stood there for a few minutes beside the trailer, looking at the road I had come from, trying to fit what had happened into some kind of standard procedure. But there was no standard, no official procedure that explained two synchronized approaches, without identification and without valid radio communication. The closest thing to an answer was to accept that it had been planned and not executed by someone alone. When the real police cars arrived, the contrast became clear all too quickly. Bright lights, visible identification, direct communication. Everything that hadn't been there during the first encounter appeared effortlessly. It was at that moment that the difference ceased to be a feeling and became a confirmation. They inspected the damage, asked direct questions, and noted everything down. But even with all that documented, nothing changed the fact that I had narrowly escaped. One of the officers commented that this type of attempt wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible either, especially on less busy routes, where a fake approach could last long enough to succeed before any real intervention. That stuck with me more than anything else he said, because it wasn't an isolated incident. It was something that could happen again, at another location, with another driver. After that, I never again pulled over just because I saw a light in the rearview mirror, not without checking more than once, not without being at least minimally sure of where I was going, because that night it became clear that appearing official doesn't mean being so. And on the road, that difference becomes apparent too late when you decide to trust. The first notification appeared while I was still moving on I-80, saying that an unknown device was moving with me, and I almost ignored it because this type of alert sometimes appears incorrectly, especially on long stretches without a very stable connection. But a few minutes later another one came, identical with the same warning, and that's when I started paying attention to the truck itself, not the phone, trying to sense anything out of the ordinary, any different vibration, any noise that hadn't been there before. When I looked in the side mirror, I saw an SUV maintaining a steady distance behind me, not too close, not far enough to disappear, and the way it adjusted its speed didn't seem casual. It looked like it was matching my pace exactly. I increased my speed by a few miles above what I had been maintaining, without doing anything abrupt, just enough to test it. And in the mirror, I could see that the SUV responded in the same proportion, without delay, as if it were locked into my rhythm and not just following the road. This is not common because there is always a slight difference in reaction between drivers, but there wasn't one there. It was a clean, direct adjustment, almost too automatic to seem natural. I slowed down immediately afterwards, bringing the truck to a lower pace than I would normally use on that stretch of road. And again, the same behavior occurred. The SUV backed up by the same amount and maintained exactly the same distance, without attempting to overtake, without hesitating, just repeating the pattern as if it were already anticipating what I would do. This kind of consistency starts to become annoying quickly when you realize there's no variation whatsoever. I looked at my phone again and the notification was still there, not disappearing, not indicating an exact location, just repeating that an unknown device was moving with me. And this started to fit with what I was seeing in the mirror in a way that I could no longer ignore as a simple coincidence. The more I connected the two things, the more it ceased to be an isolated alert. The road remained open, with long stretches lacking strong lighting and few nearby stopping options, which didn't help because any decision there would have to be made with little margin for error. It was then that I noticed that the SUV not only kept its distance but also avoided aligning itself completely within the same line of sight, remaining slightly offset, as if it didn't want to disappear, but also didn't want to be observed all the time. I continued testing the behavior for a few more miles, varying the acceleration slightly and holding the truck a little more in the lane, just to see if at some point the pattern would break, but it didn't. The SUV continued adjusting everything at the same time, without error, without delay, as if it already knew every move before I made it. This began to eliminate any doubt of simple coincidence, because such precise driving doesn't exist by chance, especially on the open road. I looked at my phone again and the alert was still active, repeating the exact same message without indicating its exact location, which was worse because it was impossible to know if the device was inside the cabin, in the trailer, or attached to some external part of the truck. The more I thought about it, the more it ceased to be a technical alert and became an invisible presence accompanying every mile I drove. I decided not to stop in that open stretch of road because any stop there would leave me exposed without understanding where the risk was coming from. So I started planning the first area where I could find some structure, some light, anything that would break that control that seemed to be happening from a distance. But until I got there, I still needed to keep driving with all of that happening at the same time. Meanwhile, the SUV maintained the exact same position, neither getting too close nor disappearing. It just stayed there constantly, as if it were marking its presence without trying to draw direct attention, and this began to seem more intentional than anything else in that situation. It wasn't open pursuit, it was calculated tracking, without error, without unnecessary exposure. It was at that point that I decided I wasn't going to wait to find the device later. I needed to confirm that it was still attached to the moving truck, because if it was, stopping in the wrong place could turn it into something I wouldn't be able to control. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that it hadn't started there. I leaned slightly in the cab, trying to get an angle through the mirror, adjusting the truck's position in the lane to better see the axle line, but it wasn't easy to see clearly while moving, and any major adjustment could give away that I was trying to observe something. Even so, I started looking for any unusual spot, any different reflection in the metal structure. After a few seconds, I saw something that shouldn't be there. Small, dark, stuck near the rear axle, aligned in a way that didn't seem like an original part of the assembly, and the worst part was realizing that it vibrated differently from the rest, as if it had been attached later, not integrated into the structure. This directly matched the alert on my phone. While I was trying to visually confirm, the SUV slightly shifted its position, not to overtake, but to maintain the exact same point relative to the truck, as if ensuring it would remain out of my direct field of vision, and this made it clear that it wasn't a coincidence, it was position control. The road remained open without sufficient lighting to make me feel safe enough to stop, and the more I looked at that point on the axis, the more evident it became that it was there for a specific reason. It wasn't something lost or forgotten, it was something installed with the clear intention of accompanying. That's when I realized that every small variation I made in the steering wheel was immediately reflected in the SUV's behavior, as if whoever was behind me wasn't just following me, but tracking something fixed in the truck, and at that point it became clear that it wasn't just surveillance, it was active monitoring in real time. I slowed down more than I had been doing and pulled the truck onto the shoulder without softening too much, because there wasn't a perfect spot there, just a stretch that would give me enough space to stop without completely losing control, and the SUV reacted instantly, closing the distance more than it had done before, directly shortening the distance. That movement no longer seemed like following. It seemed like a response to a specific action. As soon as I stopped, I got out quickly, without closing the door completely, going straight to the back because if that device was really there, every second I stopped without acting only increased the risk of someone getting to it before me. The air was cooler outside, but the truck was still vibrating slightly, and that left everything more exposed than I would have liked at that moment. The truck's light helped me confirm, fastened to the axle, too firmly to be something improvised. A small dark block fitted precisely, and when I touched it, I felt it was warm, as if it had been in use long enough not to be recent. It hadn't been placed there by chance, nor right there on the road. It was at that moment that I heard the sound of the SUV stopping a few feet behind me, the door opening too quickly for someone who was just passing by, and that removed any remaining doubt about what was happening. I pulled the device forcefully without trying to understand the mechanism, because I didn't have time for that, and the instant it released, I heard footsteps coming straight towards me, without any hesitation. I ran back to the cabin without looking back, pulling the door shut and turning the key in the same motion, because any second lost out there could turn into a direct approach, and the sound of footsteps was already close enough to leave no doubt. The engine responded heavily, but it responded, and that was all I needed at that moment. I engaged the gear and pulled the truck back onto the road without perfectly aligning it, letting the rear end sway a bit more than usual, because getting out of there quickly was more important than getting out clean. And in the mirror, I could still see the man's silhouette stopping for a moment where I had been seconds before. He didn't try to chase after me, and that was worse than if he had tried. The SUV remained stationary for a few seconds and then slowly returned, without haste, without attempting an immediate recovery, as if the operation had lost its purpose the moment the device left the truck, and that confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't following me, they were following whatever was attached to the axle. Only after a few miles was I able to safely slow down, still feeling the tension in my arm from the effort of gripping the steering wheel during the abrupt start, and that's when the silence returned. No alert on the phone, no vehicle in the rearview mirror, but also without any feeling that it had actually ended normally. When I stopped at a well-lit spot, I stayed inside the cabin for a few minutes before getting out, looking at my phone, the mirror, and the road, because at that point it wasn't just about what had happened anymore. It was about understanding that it could have started long before I realized it. I stayed inside the cab with the truck off only when I was sure there were no more headlights coming from behind me, because after what happened, any light in the rearview mirror no longer seemed neutral. It always seemed to carry intent. The phone was silent now, without any alert, as if nothing had happened, and that bothered me more than if it were still beeping. When the patrol cars arrived, the difference was effortlessly obvious. Bright lights, visible identification, direct radio communication, everything aligned as a real police stop should be. This only reinforced how the previous situation had been constructed to appear legitimate enough to deceive at the right time. They checked the truck, asked about the device and the route, but when I mentioned the SUV's behavior and tracking pattern, the reaction was more restrained, as if it wasn't entirely new, just difficult to catch at the right moment. None of them treated it as an isolated incident, and that's what stayed with me most afterward. Before leaving, I mentally reviewed every stop I'd made in the last few hours, every point where someone could have accessed the truck without drawing attention, because the device didn't just appear on the road by itself. It was already there before everything started. And if I hadn't understood the pattern, I probably would have followed it without ever knowing. After that, I completely changed my routine for stopping. I no longer leave the truck without a quick check. I don't ignore digital alerts, and I don't trust vehicles maintaining a constant distance for very long. Because that day it became clear that, on the road, someone can be following you long before you realize you've become a target. Thank you for staying until the end. If you enjoy these types of human-based horror stories, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Quiet and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your engagement, likes, subs, and comments is the only way YouTube knows this channel is worth recommending to others. Don't forget to tell me your location and the current time in the comments. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.